Hi guys, Shane here with Whelan cameras, and today we'll be talking about 6 things to consider when buying a lens. The number one thing to consider before you buy a lens is, do you need a zoom or a prime? Prime lenses are known as fixed focal lengths, whereas zooms are variable. A zoom lens will give you a wider and a tighter field of view depending on where you are in the range, whereas a prime lens is always going to give you the same field of view, and in order to get a tighter or wider shot, you have to move. Now, zooms are generally more convenient because of that, but they do tend to suffer in the optical quality, and also their maximum aperture reach isn't as good as primes. Prime lenses use less glass, which means that they are smaller and lighter. It also means there's less optical aberrations as the light is passing through, and the final output is often sharper. The other big benefit of using a prime lens is your maximum aperture. Zooms often top out at f2.8. However, a prime can often go to 1.8, 1.4, sometimes 1.2, and in the most extreme examples, something like f0.95. That's for when you need absolutely nothing to be in focus. Of course, when you're dealing with those kind of extremes, it doesn't come cheap, which brings me to my next point: cost. When people are starting out in photography, I often recommend a 50mm 1.8 lens. This is also known as your nifty 50. 50mm is roughly the equivalent of what we see day to day with our eyes, so you can approximate what your image is going to look like just by looking at your scene. And 1.8 is a nice bright aperture which is going to be really useful in a wide range of situations, indoors and outdoors. Because it's small, it's easy to carry around with you, and also it's fairly affordable. These camera companies make a lot of 50mm lenses, and they're a good starting point when it comes to either photos or videos. It's a good idea to pair your 50mm 1.8 with something like the 24-105 f4. Now, f4 isn't the brightest lens out there, but 24-105 is extremely versatile. At 24, you can get those really nice landscapes, and at 105, you can get great portraits, and then everything else in between. Now, a fixed f4 means no matter where you are on the zoom range, you're always going to be able to shoot at f4. This, however, can be a little bit more pricey, so if you want to save some money, you can get a variable aperture, which means that as you zoom, your aperture will change depending on where you are. At 24, it could be as wide as 3.5, but by the time you get to 105, it could be something as tight as a 5.6 or a 6.3, depending on the lens. This isn't very good for video because as you zoom, your image will be getting brighter and darker. But if you shoot at f8 or f11 or something darker, or if you're doing photography where you don't really mind if the image gets slightly brighter and darker, then those can be really nice, affordable options. If budget is a concern, but you still want that highest quality, then it's worth looking at some third-party lenses. This Tamron is a really good example. Normally these lenses would be a 70-200 f2.8, but what Tamron have done here is they've made it a 70-180 f2.8. So you lose a little bit on the long end, but you still get your nice fixed focal length and some great quality glass to it. So obviously there are a lot of really expensive lenses out there, and if you really need that f0.95 lens, then by all means go for it. I am extremely jealous. But a lot of those lenses are really specialists, and you don't need them all of the time, which brings me to my third point: use case. Now look, I love lenses as much as the next guy, and it's easy to get carried away thinking that you need to collect them all. But these lenses are made with something specific in mind. Of course, photography and videography is very creative, and you can use any lens for anything and whatever you want to, but they were made with something specifically in mind. So if you do a lot of astrophotography, for example, you need an ultra-wide, ultra-bright lens. And yes, you could use that for portraits, but it's more likely that you're going to want to use a tight 85 or 105 lens. Same thing if you're a wedding or an events photographer, you're probably not going to want to use that prime lens. Instead, you're going to want your zoom range with a nice bright 2.8 aperture. And if you do a lot of macro work, you're unlikely to get a lot of use out of that because they have macro lenses made specifically for that kind of work. Now, of course, you can use any lens for anything and you can get really creative with it, but you don't need to feel pressured to get every lens just because there's loads out there. Get a lens that works for you, that does the job that you need it to do. One thing, however, you really do need to consider no matter what lens you're buying, and that's lens mount. So look, this one seems a little simple, but it can happen to the best of us. You spend hours online researching what lens to get, only to spend a pile of money on something that doesn't fit your camera. Canon, as an example, have 4 lens mounts at the moment. They've got their M mount, they've got their EF mount, they've got their full frame mount, and they've got their RF mount. So if you were to try and adapt your M lens, for example, that's not going to work on, say, your full frame camera. Even though sometimes it is possible to adapt different lenses for different mounts, you still often lose something in that process, either in terms of optical quality or in features and functions like autofocus. So be careful when you're buying a lens, make sure that it's the right lens for the mount that you have. If, however, you're torn between 2 lenses and you're not sure which one to go for, think about my next point, weather sealing. So weather sealing is something that will always push the price of a lens up, but it can really be worthwhile. Here in Limerick, where the weather takes a turn all of a sudden, I find it to be really important to make sure that I have that peace of mind that comes with knowing that my lenses and cameras are all weather sealed. However, if you work mostly in a studio or you're fairly diligent and you always have your bag on you, then it's maybe not something that you need to be concerned about. It's something that I definitely like, but it's something that is a more of a personal decision to you and your workflow. As I say, it will make the camera more expensive, but it can help to protect you in the long run. My last point that I want to talk about is something that you don't necessarily need to have for every lens, but it can be useful to have a general knowledge of what's out there, and that's accessories. So nearly every single lens has a lens thread on the top, and this lets you screw in things like filters. There are a few different types of filters. The most common would be something like an ND filter, a polarizing filter, or a UV filter. I have done videos on filters before, but if you want more information on them and other accessories, just let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to address that. Another thing to bear in mind would be something like a lens cloth. These are useful just for wiping away any dust or dirt that you might get on your lens as you're out and about. I wouldn't use any sprays because the sprays can damage the coatings that are already on here, so a cloth is going to be perfect just for wiping anything off. The last thing then would be something like a lens hood. Again, not a necessity, but it can be nice to have. It does block side lighting coming in, and it also just protects the front element that little bit. So yeah, again, not 100% necessity, but it's good to keep these things in mind when you're looking at different lenses. So there you go, guys. Those are 6 things to consider before you buy a lens. I hope that was useful to you, that you learned something. If you have any questions, comments, queries, just pop into us in store when you can. Otherwise, you can find us online. We're on our website, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we've got email. And if none of those work for you, you can give us a phone call. See you then, guys.